Ask him whose name is on the deed. That was the sentence that turned my husband's anger into silence. Rain swept across Lake Whitmore in silver sheets, blurring the dock lights and rattling the bare branches above the gravel drive. Daniel stood outside the front gate with his collar turned up, one hand gripping his phone and the other punching the access code for the 5th time. Red light. Denied. Beside him stood Brooke Lawson, his business partner, holding the handle of a Navy suitcase while another rested near Daniel's polished shoes. They looked less like stranded guests and more like people arriving at a life they had already decided belonged to them. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 43 years old, and until that evening, I had spent 17 years believing patience could save a marriage. At 11:38 p.m., I sat inside my grandmother's lake house with the security monitor glowing on the kitchen counter. Daniel's name filled my phone. 17 missed calls, 9 messages, 2 threats to involve the police. 3 hours earlier, he had looked directly at me in the living room and said, "You're not my wife anymore." He had not shouted. That would have been easier. He said it calmly, as if he were canceling a reservation. Then he glanced toward Brooke's overnight bag near the staircase and told me the attorneys could sort out everything else. Everything else. 17 years reduced to a phrase. I remembered staring at the old brass key in my palm, the one my grandmother Eleanor had carried for nearly 4 decades. My hand stayed steady. Only the key trembled. "Then you shouldn't be sleeping in my family's house," I told him. Daniel laughed because he thought the house was ours. Men like Daniel often confuse access with ownership. They are handed a key, welcomed through a door, given a place at the table, and eventually begin to believe they built the room. Now he stood in the rain learning the difference. Blue lights rolled across the wet trees as a county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the drive. Daniel straightened immediately. Brooke stepped closer to him, though she kept her suitcase between us like evidence neither of them wanted to explain. Through the camera speaker, I heard Daniel tell the deputy that his bitter wife had illegally locked him out of marital property. He used the word wife without hesitation. 30 minutes after declaring I was no longer one. The deputy approached the intercom and asked whether I could prove I had the authority to deny access. I pressed the talk button. My voice came out quieter than I felt. "Yes, sir. The property records are in the folder I emailed to your office." Daniel looked toward the camera. Rain moved down his face like cracks in glass. "Claire, open this gate," he said. "Not please. Never please." The deputy checked his phone, read for several seconds, then turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Bennett, do you have documentation showing your name on the deed?" Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Brooke looked at him for an answer, and for the first time that night, he seemed to realize the gate was not the real problem. The real problem was that he had built his entire plan around a house he had never owned. For hours earlier, the lake had been perfectly still. That was what I remembered most. Not the cold, not the gray sky, the silence. It rested over the water like the whole place was holding its breath. I had driven 90 miles from our home outside Chicago after the security system sent an alert that the rear door had opened. Daniel was supposed to be at a commercial property conference in Milwaukee. Brooke was supposed to be there with him. I told myself the alert was probably a sensor error, but doubt has its own weight. It sat beside me for the entire drive. When I reached the house, Daniel's black sport utility vehicle was parked behind the detached garage, hidden from the road. That was the first answer. The second was waiting inside. A pair of women's boots stood beside the mudroom bench. They were not mine. Upstairs, the guest room closet held 3 dresses, 2 jackets, and a cosmetic bag with Brooke Lawson's initials stamped in gold. The master bedroom was worse. Daniel's shirts filled half the wardrobe. His watch rested on my grandmother's dresser. A navy suitcase lay open across the quilt Eleanor had sewn by hand. He had not come for one night. He had begun moving in. I walked back downstairs without touching anything. On the dining table sat a bottle of champagne, 2 glasses, and a thick presentation binder labeled Bennett Executive Retreat. I opened it. The first page showed an artist's rendering of the lake house with a new stone terrace, a larger dock, and the Whitmore name removed from the gate. The next pages listed rental packages, corporate events, and projected revenue. Daniel had placed a price on every room where my childhood still lived. He valued the dock, the fireplace, the view. He even valued the small upstairs bedroom where I had slept during the year my parents separated. I heard a car door outside before I reached the last page. Daniel entered first, carrying takeout bags from an expensive restaurant in town. Brooke followed him, laughing until she saw me. Her expression changed. His did not. Daniel set the bags on the counter and asked why I was there, as though I had entered his property without permission. I placed the binder between us. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. Brooke looked toward him. Daniel loosened his tie and sighed. Not with guilt, with annoyance. He said the marriage had been over for months. He said I was too attached to old memories and too afraid to make practical decisions. Then he told me Brooke understood the potential of the property in a way I never had. Each sentence was calm, carefully rehearsed. He had prepared for my tears, my anger, maybe even my pleading. I gave him none of them. Then he looked at me across my grandmother's kitchen and said I was not his wife anymore. The words landed colder than the wind outside. For a moment, I stared at the man I had helped build a life with and understood that he had mistaken my kindness for permanent surrender. I looked at Brooke's suitcase near the stairs, then at the binder beneath my hand. "Are you staying here tonight?" I asked. Daniel gave a small smile. "This is my home too." That was when my phone rang. Rebecca Sloane's name appeared on the screen. I answered and walked onto the porch. After I told her what I had found, she was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Do not stop him from talking. Photograph every page. And Claire, let him sign whatever he plans to sign." I looked through the window at Daniel pouring champagne into my grandmother's glasses. He thought my silence meant he had won. He had no idea it was only giving him room to document the mistake. The house had saved me long before Daniel ever stepped inside it. I was 12 the first time my grandmother Eleanor brought me there for more than a weekend. My parents had stopped speaking to each other unless a lawyer was present, and our home had become a place where every closed door carried a secret. Eleanor arrived one Friday afternoon in her faded blue station wagon, placed my suitcase in the back, and told me I could stay with her as long as I needed. She did not ask me to choose sides. She did not tell me everything would be fine. She simply drove north until the buildings disappeared and the lake opened beside the road like a sheet of dark glass. Back then, the house was smaller and rougher. The roof leaked above the upstairs hallway. The kitchen floor tilted toward the pantry. The dock stretched only 20 feet into the water and groaned whenever the wind changed. None of that mattered. The first night, Eleanor made tomato soup and grilled cheese, then left the porch light on until morning. She said a light should always be burning for someone who needed to find the way home. I slept in the little room facing the lake and woke to sunlight moving across the ceiling. For the first time in months, I did not hear arguing through a wall. Silence did not feel dangerous there. It felt safe. Over the years, Eleanor taught me how to sand old wood, patch window screens, stack firewood, and recognize a storm by the color of the water. When I was 16, we repainted the kitchen cabinets together. When I was 22, I helped replace the damaged boards on the dock. Every repair became a kind of promise. The house would hold if we cared for it. I believe marriage worked the same way. Daniel first visited the lake 2 years after we met. He was still struggling to establish himself in real estate, wearing inexpensive suits and carrying more ambition than confidence. Eleanor liked him because he listened when she spoke. He helped her bring groceries inside and spent an entire Saturday repairing the porch steps without being asked. That evening, the three of us ate hamburgers near the water while fireflies blinked above the grass. Daniel looked at the house and said he understood why I loved it. I believed him. A year later, he proposed at the end of the dock just before sunset. The ring was modest, his hands were shaking, and his voice broke when he promised he would never make me feel alone. Eleanor watched from the porch, pretending to read. After I said yes, Daniel asked whether the house would someday belong to us. I told him it belonged to the Whitmore family, but that he would always be welcome there. He kissed my forehead and said that being welcome was enough. Standing in the kitchen 17 years later, watching him pour champagne for Brooke, I finally understood how far he had traveled from that man. He had once treated the house like a gift. Now he spoke of it like an asset he had discovered. He had removed Eleanor's photographs from the living room and stacked them face down inside a cabinet. I found them after he and Brooke left for dinner. Her wedding portrait was at the bottom, the glass dusty but unbroken. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and placed it back above the fireplace. Then I noticed something tucked behind the frame. A small envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Inside was a note containing only one sentence. Never confuse the person you welcomed with the person who owns the door. Before Daniel learned how to sell million-dollar homes, he could barely convince anyone to return his calls. He worked from a borrowed desk in the back corner of a small real estate office near Evanston, wearing the same 2 suits in rotation and driving a sedan that stalled whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. He was not ashamed of starting small. That was one of the things I loved about him. He would come home with rejected listings folded in his briefcase and still talk about the future as though he could already see it. I believed in that future before anyone else did. At the time, I was building my own career in interior design, taking modest projects and saying yes to work that paid more in experience than money. When Daniel finally landed his first serious listing, the house had good bones and terrible presentation. The walls were beige, the rooms felt empty, and every photograph looked like a waiting room. He asked whether I could help. I spent 3 weekends rearranging furniture, repainting the entryway, and borrowing lamps from my own clients. I wrote the property description because Daniel said I understood how people wanted to feel when they walked through a door. The house sold in 9 days. He earned the largest commission of his career, and we celebrated with pizza on the floor of our apartment because we still did not own a dining table. That sale led to another, then another. I staged open houses, designed brochures, introduced him to contractors, and connected him with 2 families who later became his most valuable clients. I never asked for a percentage. We were married. I thought building his success meant building ours. For years, Daniel thanked me. He would place his hand over mine at dinner and say he could not have done it without me. Somewhere along the way, the sentence changed. First, he said we had built something remarkable. Later, he said his instincts had changed our lives. Eventually, he told people he had created his company from nothing. My work disappeared from the story one detail at a time. Brooke entered that story 5 years before the night at the lake. She was sharp, polished, and fluent in the language of expansion. She managed commercial partnerships for a luxury hospitality group and spoke about properties as though every wall existed only to generate revenue. Daniel admired that. He began inviting her to meetings that once included me. Then he started calling my ideas sentimental. When I objected to replacing the old cedar siding at the lake house with black steel panels, he laughed and said I was emotionally trapped in the past. Brooke called the property underused. Daniel called her visionary. I called it my grandmother's home. That difference became the distance between us. By the time I found the retreat binder on the dining table, they had already turned their private conversations into numbers. 6 executive weekends each summer. 12 guests per event. Premium pricing for lake access. My childhood bedroom listed as Suite 4. The porch where Eleanor had waited for me was labeled a networking lounge. I turned page after page until I reached a section titled Ownership and Authorization. Daniel had signed beneath a statement declaring that he possessed full legal authority to develop and operate the property. Brooke had signed as project partner. The date was 3 weeks earlier. I photographed every page, just as Rebecca instructed. Then I looked at Daniel's signature, bold and confident, and remembered the young man whose hands had shaken when he proposed on the dock. He had once asked to be welcomed into my life. Now he was trying to sell admission to it. I sent the photographs to Rebecca. Her reply arrived less than a minute later. It contained 7 words. This is not just arrogance. This is evidence. Rebecca called me before I could put the binder back exactly where I found it. Her voice was calm, the way a good attorney sounds when panic would only waste time. She told me not to confront Daniel about the agreement, not to mention the photographs, and not to touch anything that could later be questioned. I asked whether his signature was enough to stop the project. She said it might do more than that, but only if I allowed him to keep believing his plan was intact. Silence, she reminded me, was not surrender. Sometimes it was a locked room where the truth could finish speaking. I carried the binder back to the dining table and aligned it with the edge, matching the faint dust mark beneath it. Then I walked through every room with my phone. I photographed Brooke's clothing in the guest closet, Daniel's watch on Eleanor's dresser, the removed family pictures, and the boxes labeled for future retreat supplies. In the garage, I found 6 folded tables, 12 matching chairs, and a stack of welcome folders printed with a logo Daniel had never shown me. Each folder promised guests a private luxury experience at Lake Whitmore. They had used my family name without asking. That detail hurt more than I expected. It was not just a business plan. It was erasure with polished branding. I called my younger brother, Nathan, who lived 40 miles away. He answered on the second ring and knew from my voice that something was wrong. I asked whether he remembered the metal document box Eleanor kept beneath the cedar chest in her bedroom. He went quiet, then said he had moved it to his home after her funeral because the basement had flooded that spring. I told him to bring it to Rebecca's office and not to open it in the car. Nathan asked what Daniel had done. I looked through the kitchen window at the lake and said, he forgot whose house he was standing in. Before we ended the call, Nathan reminded me of something Eleanor used to say whenever relatives argued about money. People reveal themselves fastest when they believe the papers are already signed. Daniel and Brooke returned just after 7, carrying dinner containers and wearing the relaxed expressions of people who expected no consequences. I was seated at the table with a cup of coffee and the binder closed in front of me. Daniel glanced at it, then at my face. For 1 second, uncertainty moved through his eyes. I let it pass without feeding it. He asked whether I had finally understood the opportunity. I said I understood more than I had that morning. Brooke sat across from me and began explaining projected revenue, corporate demand, and the improvements they believed the property needed. She spoke gently, almost kindly, as though presenting a plan to someone too emotional to understand numbers. I listened. I asked how many events they expected to host. I asked whether investors had seen the proposal. I asked whether Daniel had represented himself as an owner. Every answer gave Rebecca another thread to pull. Daniel relaxed with each question because he mistook precision for cooperation. Then Brooke slid a second document across the table. It was an authorization form granting their company long-term operating rights. Daniel had already signed his portion. All they needed was mine. He placed a pen beside my hand and smiled. This makes everything easier, he said. I looked down at the blank line carrying my name, then back at the man who believed he had reduced my history to a signature. I picked up the pen, and for the first time that evening, Daniel stopped talking. I held the pen above the signature line long enough for Daniel to mistake hesitation for surrender. Brooke leaned forward, her smile careful and encouraging, as though she were helping me accept an inevitable decision. Then I placed the pen beside the document without touching the paper. I need time to read everything, I said. Daniel's expression tightened. He reminded me that delays could cost them investors and that the first retreat was scheduled for early summer. That was the first time he admitted guests had already been promised access. I asked how many deposits they had accepted. Brooke answered before he could stop her. 4 companies had reserved dates, and 2 had paid non-refundable planning fees. The room became very quiet. Daniel tried to soften the admission by calling them preliminary commitments, but I had heard enough. He had sold the use of a house he did not own, and he had done it before asking for my consent. I folded my hands on the table and told them I would give an answer the following morning. Daniel looked relieved. Arrogance often hears only what it expects. He assumed one night would give me time to become reasonable. In reality, it gave Rebecca time to protect the property. Daniel and Brooke left shortly after 8 to meet a potential vendor in town. Their headlights disappeared beyond the trees, and the house seemed to exhale. I moved quickly, but not carelessly. Rebecca had already contacted the security company and a licensed locksmith who lived near the county line. By 9, the keypad codes had been reset, Daniel's electronic key had been disabled, and the security account had been transferred entirely into my name. I placed his clothing, watch, and personal items into sealed storage containers on the covered side porch. I photographed every item before closing the lids. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was hidden. Every step had a record. At 10:30, Nathan arrived with Eleanor's metal document box. He set it on the kitchen table, rain shining on his jacket, and asked whether I was certain. I looked at the authorization form Daniel expected me to sign. I am certain he already made his choice, I said. Nathan stayed while I opened the box. Inside were tax records, trust statements, old insurance documents, and a letter from Eleanor's attorney dated 2 years before my wedding. Rebecca joined us by video call and reviewed the first pages. Her face did not change, but her voice became even more precise. She told me the lake house was protected more thoroughly than Daniel understood. Before she could explain further, headlights swept across the front windows. Daniel's vehicle stopped outside the gate. He entered the old code once. Then again, the keypad flashed red. Brooke stepped out beneath an umbrella while Daniel called me. I let the first 3 calls go unanswered. On the 4th, I picked up. Open the gate, he said. His voice carried the confidence of a man who still believed volume could replace authority. I told him his belongings were secured on the side porch and that he could arrange collection through Rebecca. He called me vindictive. Then he said the house was marital property and warned that the police would force me to admit him. I looked at Eleanor's papers spread beneath the kitchen light. You should call them, I said. 20 minutes later, the county cruiser arrived. Daniel spoke first, presenting himself as the reasonable husband locked out by an emotional wife. The deputy listened, checked the records I had emailed, and asked Daniel for proof of ownership. He had none. When the deputy told him he would need to leave, Brooke took one step away from him. It was small, almost invisible, but I noticed. Daniel looked toward the camera above the gate. Tomorrow, I am taking this house and everything else you think belongs to you, he said. I pressed the intercom button. Tomorrow is exactly what I have been waiting for. Daniel kept his promise about the next morning, just not in the way he expected. At 9:15, Rebecca received an emergency petition from his attorney demanding immediate access to the lake house. By noon, the petition had grown into a list of claims. Daniel wanted reimbursement for the new dock, the roof repairs, the kitchen appliances, and every improvement he said had increased the property value during our marriage. He also demanded a share of the income from the retreat project, even though the project had never legally existed. On paper, he presented himself as a devoted husband who had invested years of labor and money into a shared home. He presented me as an angry wife using a family disagreement to destroy a promising business. Daniel always knew how to sell a story. He simply forgot that stories become fragile when documents begin asking questions. Rebecca arranged a settlement conference at her downtown Chicago office 3 days later. I arrived early with Eleanor's metal box and the original retreat binder. Daniel entered with his attorney, Martin Keller, a confident man in a charcoal suit who spoke as though every sentence had already been approved by a judge. Brooke arrived separately and sat beside Daniel without looking at me. The distance between their chairs was barely 6 inches, but it felt wider than the lake. Martin began with the improvements. He placed receipts across the conference table and described Daniel's contributions as substantial investments. $22,000 for the dock, $14,000 for roof work, nearly $9,000 for kitchen upgrades. He argued that even if the property began as a Whitmore family asset, Daniel had helped transform it into something more valuable. Rebecca studied each receipt without interrupting. Then Martin introduced the business plan. He said Daniel and Brooke had spent months developing a legitimate hospitality venture and that my refusal to cooperate had caused financial harm. Daniel leaned back as if the outcome had already been decided. I watched him carefully. He looked calm, but his thumb kept rubbing the edge of his wedding ring. Rebecca asked whether any companies had paid money based on Daniel's promise that the property would be available. Martin hesitated. Brooke answered that 4 planning fees had been accepted, but she called them refundable deposits. Rebecca asked whether the companies had been told Daniel owned the house. This time, no one answered. She opened the retreat binder and placed the signed authorization page in front of Daniel. His name appeared beneath a statement confirming full legal control of the property. Martin read it twice. The confidence in his posture changed by 1 careful inch. He argued that Daniel had reasonably believed his marriage gave him authority. Rebecca asked whether he still considered himself my husband when he signed it. Daniel looked at me, and the words from that night returned to the room without being spoken. Then Rebecca opened Eleanor's document box. She removed the trust papers, the property records, and a thin agreement dated 6 months after our wedding. Martin reached for the trust document, but Rebecca kept her hand on it. "We will get there," she said. "First, I would like Mr. Bennett to explain the reimbursement agreement he signed 17 years ago." Daniel frowned. He said he had never signed such a thing. Rebecca turned the document toward him. His signature sat at the bottom of page 14. The room went still. Martin read the paragraph above it, then removed his glasses. Every payment Daniel had made toward the house had been classified in writing as voluntary maintenance in exchange for personal use, with no ownership rights created or implied. Daniel stared at the page as though it had appeared from nowhere. Rebecca folded her hands. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "did you ever read page 14? Daniel did not answer Rebecca's question. He kept staring at page 14, his signature sitting beneath language he had agreed to 17 years earlier and apparently forgotten. Martin Keller leaned closer, reading each line with the slow attention of a man watching the floor shift beneath his chair. The agreement was clear. Any money Daniel contributed to repairs, maintenance, or improvements gave him permission to enjoy the property during our marriage. It gave him nothing more. No equity, no ownership, no future claim. Daniel finally said he had signed dozens of papers after our wedding and could not be expected to remember every detail. Rebecca nodded once. That is why people are expected to read them. She opened the next folder. Inside was the Whitmore Family Trust, created by Eleanor 3 years before I married Daniel. The lake house had never belonged to me personally. I was the managing beneficiary, responsible for preserving it for the Whitmore family. I could live there, maintain it, and approve temporary guests. I could not sell it without Nathan's consent, and no spouse could gain ownership through marriage, renovation, or occupancy. Daniel's face changed as he read. The confidence disappeared first, then the anger. What remained was calculation. He asked whether the trust could be challenged. Martin did not answer immediately, which answered for him. Brooke shifted in her seat. Until that moment, she had watched the documents as though they concerned only Daniel and me. Then Rebecca placed the retreat authorization beside the trust. This creates a different issue, she said. Daniel had represented himself as having full authority to operate a commercial business on protected family property. For companies had paid planning fees based on that representation. The lake house had also been advertised in private investor materials without approval from the trust. Daniel claimed it was a misunderstanding. Brooke turned toward him. You told me Claire had already agreed, she said. Her voice was quiet, but the distance inside it was unmistakable. Daniel reminded her that they had developed the project together. Brooke opened her leather portfolio and removed a series of printed emails. She said Daniel had repeatedly described himself as the owner and had assured her that my signature was a formality. Then she slid the emails toward Martin instead of Daniel. That movement was small. Final, but small. Their partnership ended in the space between two chairs. Rebecca explained that the deposits would need to be returned immediately and that every company involved would receive written notice that the project had never been authorized. She also stated that the trust reserved the right to recover any costs caused by Daniel's representations. Daniel looked at me as though I had created the documents, the signatures, and the promises he had made. You planned this, he said. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny left between us. No, I replied. I protected what you planned to take. He said he had believed the house was part of our life together. I reminded him that sharing a place was not the same as owning it. Being welcomed was not the same as holding the deed. Rebecca gathered the documents into a single stack and placed Eleanor's trust on top. Daniel's eyes followed it. He had entered the room expecting to divide my family's property. He was leaving with no claim to the house, no retreat business, and a partner who no longer trusted his version of the truth. As Martin quietly requested a private conference with his client, Daniel removed his wedding ring and set it on the table. The sound was barely louder than a raindrop against glass. You wanted me outside the gate, he said. I looked at the ring, then at him. You locked yourself out long before I changed the code. The divorce was finalized 5 months later on a clear October morning. There was no dramatic courtroom speech and no public collapse. There were signatures, careful negotiations, and the quiet division of a life that had once seemed permanent. Daniel withdrew every claim against the lake house after Martin explained how little room the documents left for argument. The companies received their money back. The retreat project disappeared from the internet. Brooke ended their partnership before the first settlement meeting was over, and the hospitality group she worked for released a formal notice stating that she had not been authorized to offer the property. Daniel kept his real estate business, his car, and the apartment he rented downtown. I kept my design firm, my grandmother's brass key, and the right to decide who crossed the gate. I did not celebrate his losses. By then, I understood that peace and victory were not the same thing. Victory still looks backward. Peace finally stops, checking whether someone regrets what they did. 3 weeks after the divorce became official, Daniel drove to the lake alone. The security camera alerted me just before sunset. He parked outside the gate and stood there without an umbrella, though a light rain had begun. He looked older than he had in Rebecca's office. Not defeated, just smaller without the certainty he used to wear. I walked down the gravel drive, but remained inside the gate. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The lake moved behind me, dark blue beneath the autumn sky. Daniel said he was not there to argue. He only wanted to walk to the end of the dock one last time. That was where he had proposed. That was where we had once believed our future began. His voice softened when he said it, and for one dangerous moment, memory tried to make the decision for me. I remembered his shaking hands, Eleanor pretending not to watch, and the ring catching the last light over the water. I remembered the man who had repaired the porch steps without being asked. Then I remembered Brooke's suitcase, the removed photographs, and my childhood bedroom listed as Suite 4. A memory can be honest and still belong to someone who no longer exists. That man was welcome here, I said. You chose not to be him. Daniel lowered his eyes. He did not ask again. Before leaving, he placed the old electronic key on the stone pillar beside the gate, even though it had been useless for months. Then he walked back to his car and drove away. I stood there until the red taillights disappeared through the trees. The next morning, Nathan helped me restore the Whitmore name above the entrance. We removed the retreat supplies from the garage and donated the tables and chairs to a community center. I returned Eleanor's photographs to the walls, repaired the frame Daniel had taken down, and placed her note inside the drawer beside her brass key. That evening, I sat at the end of the dock with a cup of coffee while the porch light glowed behind me. For most of my life, I had believed the house existed to shelter people who needed somewhere to return. I still believe that. I had simply learned that keeping a light on did not require leaving every door unlocked. The water turned gold beneath the setting sun, and the silence no longer felt like something waiting to break. It felt like mine.